A director who has had quite an interesting career, especially in the area of technical innovation, is Robert Zemeckis. Whether he's making a comedy or a period piece or an action film, he's someone who's carved out a particular style even as he jumps from one genre to the next. I also think he's a filmmaker who deserves more respect for his accomplishments. He seems to have a fascination with making the seemingly impossible come to life, as well as a curiosity with celebrities and their longevity. This even goes back to Zemeckis' feature directing debut I Want to Hold Your Hand, about a group of Beatles fans. Even though this was a fairly low-budget studio film, made thanks to the support of his mentor Steven Spielberg, you can still see plenty of his hallmarks as he found creative ways to use the 1964-era Beatles in the film, thanks to doubles with their faces obscured, camera angles, and the use of television sets. I Want to Hold Your Hand also displayed Zemeckis' interest in developing wild situations that test his characters and change them over the course of the film. From that first movie, he already crafted his own voice and showed his influences from television and pop culture figures. While his classmates at USC Film School gravitated towards films from avant-garde European directors, Zemeckis had a preference for the works of Frank Capra and Walt Disney. Considering those are also two of Spielberg's biggest inspirations, is it any surprise he gravitated towards Zemeckis' student films and wanted to work with him? He has always wanted to give his audience a journey and provide them with some emotional connection to his characters and the worlds they inhabit, and that's evident throughout his entire filmography. Like any director, he does have specific periods which to divide his movies. When I think of his early period, during the late 70s and 80s, I think of zippy comedies that do attempt to push what the genre is capable of. I Want to Hold Your Hand uses the teen comedy template to comment on the fascination young people have with celebrity and did a solid job of dividing time between multiple characters. Meanwhile, Romancing the Stone provided its own spin on the romantic comedy by mixing it with the adventure film. That's a movie that summarily builds as the events propel the characters down some wacky roads. We know by the end that Michael Douglas and Kathleen Turner will end up together, but the movie still finds a unique way of showing how their relationship grows. While I Want to Hold Your Hand and Used Cars planted the early seeds of his filmography, Romancing the Stone would serve as his first major success and prove to his critics that he could direct a film without Spielberg in the producer's chair. Of course, when I think of Robert Zemeckis, the first movie that comes to mind is Back to the Future, which is my favorite film of any he has directed. He took the concept of a time travel movie and turned it into a comment on nostalgia. While the generation who grew up in the 50s look back fondly on that decade, Marty McFly has no interest in sticking around and just wants to return to the 80s. It's a movie that clearly had so much care put into the screenplay by Zemeckis and Bob Gale. The reason people keep coming back to it is because of the little details that make it so rewarding on multiple viewings. It's a film that combines his fascination with the past with the possibilities of the future, via the time-traveling DeLorean and its flux capacitor. Like the best movies, you truly get to know these characters over the course of the story and feel invested in them, hoping the heroes succeed and the villain gets defeated. I actually think the part where George McFly finally finds his courage and stops Biff is one of the most cathartic scenes in cinema history. The entire movie is filled with these brilliant moments that come about because the script is so clever and the direction is so smart. The sequels have their own accomplishments too. Back to the Future Part 2 was particularly innovative for its use of special effects. A lot of people remember the depiction of Hill Valley in 2015, but what always amazes me is seeing Michael J. Fox play multiple characters in the same scene. There were films that did this sort of thing before, like The Parent Trap, but Back to the Future Part 2 took it to another level. The visual effects artist and Industrial Light and Magic developed a new system that allows Zemeckis freedom to move the camera however he pleased without losing the immersion. Thus, it became believable seeing Fox play Marty, his son, and his daughter in the same frame. The idea of having Marty return to the events of Part 1 and see them through a new point of view was also extremely clever. Back to the Future Part 3, meanwhile, sought to pay tribute to classic westerns while emotionally concluding Marty and Doc's story. The fact that Zemeckis filmed the sequels back-to-back but still gave them their own unique feel, with Part 2 being darker in tone and Part 3 being lighter and more romantic, deserves praise. Zemeckis' other landmark film of the 80s was Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Like the Back to the Future trilogy, this was another brilliant marriage of creating an extremely well-told story with impressive use of visual effects which broke so many conventional rules. Even though there were previous films that combined live action and animation, Zemeckis and animation director Richard Williams wanted to give Roger Rabbit a whole new energy, reflecting the classic Warner Brothers and MGM cartoons the film would take heavy influence from. Zemeckis and his director of photography, Dean Cundey, would move the camera however they pleased and trusted the animators would keep up. There were so many clever tricks used to seamlessly integrate Roger and the other animated characters into the film and have them interact with Bob Hoskins, Christopher Lloyd, and the other actors on set. However, the movie also created an engaging mystery, even though we know who the villain obviously is, inspired by real Californian history. It's one of the most important films in the history of animation for a reason. In the 90s, he would continue to expand his storytelling horizons, as well as playing around with the newest technology. Death Becomes Her is a silly movie but an enjoyable one that again uses some of Zemeckis' favorite trademarks. One is of course the special effects. It was the first movie to use computers to create realistic human skin texture, and some of its techniques will be particularly helpful in the creation of Steven Spielberg's Jurassic Park. The standout moment in the film is when Goldie Hawn appears with a giant hole in the middle of her stomach, and it looks remarkable. Zemeckis' fascination with classic pop culture figures is also shown through some of the deceased celebrities who appear in a pivotal scene, courtesy of actors made to look exactly like them. Speaking of which, Forrest Gump would take this a step further. Throughout the movie, we see Forrest interact with famous people like John F. Kennedy and Elvis Presley, a few times through archival footage and other points with doubles. Some of the best parts of the film involve him sliding into real history, and through Zemeckis' direction, we believe it. This was his first time directing a mostly dramatic film, with Forrest Gump often criticized for being overly sentimental. And yes, it is, but I think the movie works because the lead character is so likable and his journey through history is so compelling. He would explore scientific exploration with Contact, which continued the sentimental themes of Forrest Gump. After making films that show the impossible happening on screen, this film featured a protagonist wanting to prove her doubters that she is capable of meeting extraterrestrial life. It's a film that celebrates the wonders of science, which makes sense, seeing as it was based on a book by famed astronomer Carl Sagan. It's also a film that looks into the conflict that can sometimes arise between religion and science, and Zemeckis and the screenwriters handle that subject matter well. One of the most intriguing parts of Contact comes from its use of news footage and real figures. Instead of creating a fictional president, Zemeckis decided to use actual press conferences spoken by Bill Clinton and seamlessly incorporate them into the film by finding and carefully editing certain speeches to make it sound like he was talking about the film's events. This was controversial, with the White House being displeased with what they perceived as a misuse of the president's image in such a way they thought would fool some audience members. However, it's yet another example of Zemeckis using film technology to incorporate real people into his storytelling. He continued to try new things with What Lies Beneath, a Hitchcockian thriller, and then Castaway. One of the most impressive things about Castaway was not even a special effect at all, but rather volleyball with a face drawn on it. Somehow, Zemeckis and Tom Hanks made us believe that the stranded FedEx executive Chuck Nolan had formed a genuine bond with that ball, appropriately named Wilson. It even results in one of the most heartbreaking scenes in any Zemeckis film. How many directors can say they made the audience emotionally attached to a volleyball? It was after this that he would enter his motion capture era, which was where some people start to fall off, but it did show his continued desire to experiment with technology. With The Polar Express, he wanted to tell a classic Christmas story. Beowulf turned the famous poem into a big action spectacle, and then A Christmas Carol brought its own take on the frequently adapted Charles Dickens story. Zemeckis has often had a love for moving the camera in ways that pushed the boundaries of what was possible, and with motion capture he found an avenue where he was not boxed in by any limitations. There's a scene in The Polar Express that most exists just to take the audience through the snowy mountains, while another has a train speed through crazy tracks like a roller coaster. When making Beowulf, Zemeckis told writers Roger Avary and Neil Gaiman to not limit their imagination, as everything was going to be done on the computer anyway. Admittedly, the technology had a number of drawbacks. Much has been said about the uncanny valley effect, with the people trying to look realistic but always feeling a little off. The characters often moved robotically, and many of them were made to look too much like the actors playing the roles. I think the best looking character in any of these three movies was Scrooge in A Christmas Carol, mainly because they made Jim Carrey look like the old miser straight out of the Dickens story rather than simply Jim Carrey. However, it's understandable why Zemeckis was fascinated with this new way of filmmaking. I admit his filmography since returning to live action movies has been mixed, but there's still a bit of that spark somewhere. I thought The Walk was an impressive and charming retelling of Philippe Petit's tightrope walk between the World Trade Center towers. It was done in the style of a heist film, which added a layer of fun to the proceedings. Petit's walk, the centerpiece of the film, succeeded giving us the sensation of being up there with him, especially if we got the chance to see it in IMAX 3D, although it's definitely not recommended for anyone with a fear of heights. The rest of his filmography the past several years has seen him experiment with effects or direct more human-focused movies, but seem held back by their stories. Flight has a great sequence involving an airplane crash and a solid performance by Denzel Washington, but then becomes a strange anti-drug PSA. Allied sought to make an old-fashioned World War II movie straight out of the 40s, but the story only sporadically became engaging. Welcome to Marwen gave Zemeckis another opportunity to experiment with motion capture through the main character's dolls, but those sequences get in the way of the human story it's trying to tell. The Witches struggled with adapting Roald Dahl's book, but only truly coming alive when the lead character is transformed into a mouse, and Zemeckis has fun depicting him scurrying through the hotel to stop the witches. His most recent film was a live-action remake of Disney's classic animated version of Pinocchio, which got probably the most vicious reviews of his career, and I personally found that unfair. The movie may have tried too hard to replicate the earlier Disney film rather than be its own thing, and there were a few other unusual creative choices, including Tom Hanks' performance as Geppetto. However, there were moments of inspiration. I liked the way it developed Pinocchio's arc, and I found the computer animation on characters like Jiminy Cricket, Honest John, and even the little wooden boy himself to be impressive. I thought the movie was nothing particularly special, but it was otherwise watchable enough. Being familiar with his previous movies, it also makes sense why this project would be attractive to him. A lot of the reviews out there got so mean and cruel towards something that, at the end of the day, was just a harmless family film. You'll have people wondering if Robert Zemeckis has lost his touch, and while it's true I've not been all that wowed by most of his recent output, this is still the same director who brought us Back to the Future, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, Romancing the Stone, Forrest Gump, Castaway, and The Walk. He is someone who has been a pivotal force in the evolution of visual effects technology and accomplishing things on screen once thought as difficult, but making it look so easy. Whether he's directing a wacky comedy or telling a dramatic story that brings the characters to far-off places, Zemeckis has shown an impressive skill behind the camera and excitement in playing around with what film is capable of. He is someone who understands the importance of every tool in the filmmaking kit. Robert Zemeckis is a director I'll always admire, and I would like to thank him for sharing his limitless imagination with us. See you next time.